Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Hans von Spakovsky. He was a policy board member of the American Civil Rights Union and a former member of the Federal Election Commission. From Philadelphia is Michael Johns. He's the co-founder of the Tea Party and a former speechwriter for President H.W. Bush. And in New York is Jake Faleschini. He's the director of the Federal Courts Program at the Center for American Progress. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. Jake, let me begin with you. Is the retirement of Anthony Kennedy that significant, or are Democrats just overreacting a little bit?
This is incredibly earth-shattering. It would be, I think, difficult to underscore just how incredibly important this actually is for our country and our Constitution and our constitutional democracy at the moment. The rights of LGBT people, of women to access safe and legal abortion, of anyone trying to access affordable health care, all of those rights and several others are under threat. Michael
Johns, incredibly earth-shattering. Tell me why you disagree.
Well, I do acknowledge it's an important appointment. I mean, obviously, whenever you have an opportunity to appoint a Supreme Court justice who likely in this case is going to be there for 3 or more decades, it's considerably important. On the other hand, you know, this is why we have elections in the United States. We had one in 2016. The issues related to the court, all of these themes, not just the issue that's receiving the most attention of Roe v. Wade and abortion, but many other themes received a lot of deliberation and debate and consideration. The American people have decided to move in a direction. And so the president is, looking at an appointment that I think is going to reflect, importantly, if you're concerned about the Constitution, which I think we all are, an originalist approach, meaning that the Constitution means what it says, that it's not the role of the Supreme Court to be either, putting together legislation or actually, engaged in activist approaches from the court. So I think we're likely to see whoever emerges from this, someone who's committed to the Constitution and the employment of it.
Okay, that's interesting because both of you agree that it is important, but for different reasons. And I guess you both disagree on your interpretation of what the Constitution actually means. Hans, to Jake's point about the fact that LGBT rights, abortion rights, minority rights, voting rights, these things will now be under threat based on who Trump's replacement is, and we expect that to be a conservative. Your response to that is what?
Well, my response is I think that's a gross exaggeration. I'll just give you a couple of examples. In the term that just ended of the U.S. Supreme Court, there were 19 cases that were decided 5-4. Justice Kennedy was the 5th vote in all of those cases, all 19 of them, including the travel ban case. He was also the fifth vote that just threw out, as a First Amendment violation, requirements that the state of California was putting on pro-life centers in the abortion area. So, yeah, while there may be some change if the president puts a new nominee on the court, in many cases, majority of cases, Justice Kennedy was already voting with the other conservative members of the court. And on healthcare, remember, he was one of the dissenters that voted in the Obamacare decision to say that the Obamacare health law was unconstitutional.
Right. Okay. So, Jake, what kind of, who's this phantom liberal judge the Democrats and liberals are pining for? Because on all these recent issues, including voting rights in Texas and Ohio recently, on the Muslim ban, which we will talk about a little bit later on, Justice Kennedy was on side with all the conservatives.
It's true that in this term, Justice Kennedy did decide more with the 4 conservatives than he did with the liberals, but that hasn't always been the case going back decades. Justice Kennedy has traditionally been the one swing vote from the conservative side who has been willing to join with liberals. He built the entire constitutional structure that's recognized the rights of LGBTQ Americans, siding with the 4 liberals. He also has been one of the few swing justices who's been willing to recognize the incredible impact that the Constitution and the laws have on minorities in America, and have been willing to recognize minority rights. So I don't think that it's an exaggeration, especially when it comes to Roe v. Wade and other areas of settled law. to suggest that this will be a threat on the current constitutional structure of American rights.
Right. Hans, when you hear Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic minority leader in the House, saying, and I quote, Kennedy's successor could radically alter the course of American justice for decades, the future of our democracy is at stake, what's your response to that?
Well, my response to that is that when liberal justices create rights that are not in our Constitution, that is a very anti-democratic process, and that's what threatens our democracy, not judges who uphold the Constitution as it's written and our Bill of Rights with the rights that it has in it.
Jake?
The Constitution has an equal protection clause, and our liberal justices and Justice Kennedy have been working to uphold that for all Americans. I think what's incredibly at threat is the idea that these constitutional protections for minorities will just be thrown away with very little recognition of how it's impacting minorities in the United States.
Right. Michael Johns, let me ask you, if you were on the other side of the fence, if you were a Democrat, what should the Democrats do? Should they maybe tactically try and block an appointment until the midterms and try and win those midterms? Is that what you think they should do if you were on their side?
What they shouldn't be doing is what they're doing now, which is essentially acknowledging and announcing their opposition to a nominee who's not even going to be announced for another week yet. So I think both from a tactical and a political standpoint, they're reflecting that they're just going to be oppositionists and resistance-oriented no matter what. So that's an error. I do think the Senate's role in advising consent is hugely important. We went through this ourselves with the Kagan nomination, and our approach was to vigorously question Justice Kagan on a number of issues that were considered critically important. And ultimately, when it came to the vote, there had to be an acknowledgement of the president's authority to make an appointment. And unless there's some completely outstanding, remarkable and egregious reason to oppose the nomination,
right,
that comes either as a matter of principle or that comes out of the hearings, you have to vote to approve that nominee. And I expect that's largely what will happen. And I think it'll be a closer, more contentious vote than it needs to be, and that's not good for the country necessarily.
Jake, are you jumping the gun by maybe saying the checks and balances have been weakened already before we even know who Trump wants to appoint?
Trump already made explicit who it is that he wants to appoint to the Supreme Court. He said that he has a list of 25 that he'll be choosing from. On the campaign trail and afterwards, he said he had explicit litmus tests for who those folks would be and what beliefs they would bring to the court. Some of those were overturning Roe v. Wade, failing to protect the rights of LGBTQ Americans, and then he criticized Justice John Roberts for his decisions on upholding the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. No, I don't think that we're jumping the gun. If anything, I think that our senators need to be stronger in saying that they will accept no one from this list of narrow-minded elitists that have been put forward by the Trump administration after being vetted by right-wing special interest groups.
Hans, do you buy any of that?
No. The list of 25 are all people with stellar credentials, with terrific backgrounds, and that kind of insulting attack, unfortunately, is what we're going to see in the upcoming fight. Look, I don't agree with many of the views on the law that Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan have. But look, they were approved because the President Obama, had the right to choose them, and they had the professional credentials required to be on the court. Unfortunately, what we're going to see is a propaganda war that is probably going to be the vilest, nastiest attack we've ever seen on someone being nominated for the court. And the attacks have started before the person's even been named. That shows how incredibly unfair these attacks are going to be.
Jake, is that fair?
No, I mean, we've had a chance to know who these people are. Sure, they may be credentialed, but credentialed does not a constitutionalist make. I mean, we see that with many of the decisions that have been coming out recently to radically alter the law. We saw that in the Muslim ban decision, where the Chief Justice with the 4 with Kennedy and 3 other conservatives, decided to essentially ignore the president's explicit statements denigrating an entire population of Americans and immigrants.
Right.
And so, no, I don't think it's at all unfair.
Okay, we're going to actually sort of drill down and focus on the travel ban or the Muslim ban. Now we're going to say goodbye to Hans von Spakovsky and bring in Jonathan Smith. He's the legal director at Muslim Advocates. They work to guarantee freedom and justice for Americans of all faiths. Jonathan, I know you're against the travel ban or the Muslim ban, but do you believe it goes so far as to build in discrimination into U.S. law?
It does. You know, President Trump ran on a platform and a campaign of anti-Muslim bigotry and discrimination. On national television, he said things like, Islam hates us. He called for a complete and total shutdown of Muslims into the United States. And so the Supreme Court's decision to affirm his Muslim ban sends the message to all Americans that bigotry and discrimination are acceptable. And that's a disgrace not just for those individuals directly impacted by the policy. It's a disgrace for all Americans who value our constitutional norms of equality and justice for all people.
Michael Johns, has the Supreme Court rubber-stamped bigotry?
Absolutely not. I mean, firstly, this is not a Muslim ban. The vast majority of Muslims are free to travel to the United States. 2 of the countries included in the 7, Venezuela and North Korea, have very minimal Muslim populations.
Although those were added later on in a revision
in these respective
countries.
countries.
Michael, we know the roots
Correct.
of the proposal, right? So the president himself has used those words, and that's why we use them.
Yeah, well, and I do understand that, and I think you have to separate a position that the president took after the San Bernardino attacks, I believe it was, during the campaign, from the reality of what he's doing and has done in 2018, which is to take 7 countries that were identified by the previous Democratic administration as not having concrete or fundamentally sound vetting processes for individuals entering the United States. So the primary obligation of the President of the United States, which I think many liberals have forgotten, is not to opening our country to any and all foreigners who want to come here, but to the security of American citizens. And when there's good reason to believe, as there is in these 7 cases, that the individuals involved have not been sufficiently vetted and they could potentially represent a threat to the United States, that needs to be employed. Finally, I would just point out, in all 7 cases, there is a waiver process that's available. So it's not a complete suspension of all ability to enter the U.S. if there's a compelling reason to do it, for business reasons, for students who may be attending U.S. universities, for other compelling reasons. There is an opportunity to apply that. And so, finally, it's a suspension, not a termination, meaning those countries already have been removed from the list, Chad, for instance, and others could be as they improve their vetting process.
Okay, and this is interesting. Jake, let me ask you from a legal perspective, do you buy the argument that, okay, we know the roots might have been a certain thing after San Bernardino, the president said some things, he was angry, there was a populist wave, there was an election and so forth, but it evolved and it went through legal processes as well. They even included Venezuela and North Korea, and that's what got to the debate within the Supreme Court. It's a different animal right now which has legal validity. Do you think that that checks out for you?
It doesn't. You can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. At the end of the day, the president said explicitly on the campaign trail that he was looking to ban Muslims from the United States. He had it up on his website until May after when he took office. His legal advisors have it said on the record that the president instructed them to find a legal way to enact a Muslim ban in the United States. The 2 predominantly non-Muslim countries that are now a part of the travel ban already had restrictions in place, and the restrictions that are the exceptions and the waivers that have been put in place for people traveling from the Muslim countries that are still a part of the ban have not been rigorously or uniformly enforced. So no, I don't buy that argument. This is still a Muslim ban.
Okay, so
just as Justice Sotomayor said in her dissent.
Right, and she did, yes, and she was joined by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she said it is of no moment that Trump included minor restrictions on North Korea and Venezuela. So, Jonathan, let me get your opinion on Anthony Kennedy vacating his seat, along with what this means for something like the Muslim ban. And this is the way I'm going to do it. You have the Supreme Court, affirming this ruling, right? Passing the travel ban. Now there's a vacancy. The swing vote is gone. We know it's quite likely that President Trump is going to put in a more conservative-leaning judge of his choosing who might support further restrictions, perhaps, on this sort of issue. What does that mean for you in terms of civil rights and civil rights of Muslims in America when you see this vacancy and you know that it's going to be filled by a Trump pick?
Well, first and foremost, it's imperative that the Supreme Court be an institution that values the core values and beliefs of our democracy. And it's imperative, now that we have a new vacancy on the court, that the President and Congress and the Senate make sure that whoever is nominated and ultimately confirmed conforms with those basic values and beliefs. And so we, as many other civil rights organizations, will do our part to make sure that whoever is nominated actually will respect the Equal Protection Clause, will respect all the guarantees in our Constitution and our laws. And yes, to your broader question, this is a very dark day, not in this country, not just for American Muslims, but for immigrant communities, for communities of color, for all people who feel demonized and vilified and attacked. And so it's really important that we, as all Americans, come together and demand that our president and our elected officials nominate and confirm people that will protect all Americans, regardless of where they come from or what they believe.
Michael Johns, do you have sympathy with that perspective?
I'd like to, but I don't. I think it's a very vague allegation. It's a very serious allegation, and it's not rooted in any fundamental fact. If you have an issue with U.S. immigration policy, and particularly the travel ban, you need to go back to the 1952 statute, because it is the obligation of Congress, the body of the people, of elected representatives, to create immigration policy for the United States of America. It is not the role of the Supreme Court to do that, and it's undeniably true that that 1952 statute gave the President of the United States complete authority over travel rights into the U.S. His steps could have been much more restrictive than they actually were and still been entirely constitutional. And unfortunately, I think this is the place we found ourselves in with contemporary liberalism, is that they've been unable to win the elections necessary to conduct governance through proper channels. They've attempted to govern through the courts. And what President Trump correctly is doing is sending a message that that is not the role of any of our courts, and certainly not of the Supreme Court. It is the role of the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution and the laws thereof, not to make laws.
Final response from you, Jonathan. Go ahead.
I think that that's a really disappointing response. And I think, to not acknowledge that there's been a rise of hate crimes, to not acknowledge that there's been a rise of acts of discrimination and bigotry and hatred in our country is to put your head in the sand and not pay attention to what we see every day in this country. This isn't about the Supreme Court legislating. It's about the Supreme Court and all elected officials and all appointed officials holding up our sacred obligations in this country. And so it is really important, not just in the context of the Muslim ban, but moreover, that we make sure that we adhere to those fundamental values, that we adhere to what makes us great as a country. What makes us great is when we're inclusive, when we're inviting, when we don't turn away people because of what they look like. And unfortunately, this president is taking us down a wrong road, a dark road, and hopefully all people will come together and say enough is enough. That's simply not who we are as Americans, and that's not what our country represents.
Okay, gentlemen, I'd love to continue, but I've got to move on. I'd love to have you all back on the program in the not-too-distant future. Michael Johns, Jake Faleschini, Jonathan Smith, and earlier Hans von Spakovsky. I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers.